February 1st, 1943, at 25,000 feet over Tunisia, the sky was burning. Shards of aluminum spun through the sunlight like metallic snow. The B-17, all-American, trembled violently as flak shells detonated around it, tearing open panels of its fuselage. Smoke curled from the starboard engine. The air inside the cockpit reeked of oil and cordite. Sergeant Kendrick in the tailgunner's position felt the world tilt as cannon shells ripped through the rear fuselage. Then came a deafening explosion, followed by silence. The tail section was gone. Half the horizontal stabilizer hung by threads of metal, fluttering in the freezing air. Every logical calculation said the plane should have fallen apart in seconds. But it didn't. Inside, the crew clung to their stations, eyes wide, faces pale under oxygen masks. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, gripped the controls with numb hands, feeling the fortress fight against gravity itself. Wind howled through torn metal, whistling like a scream. Behind them, Luftwaffe fighters circled, hesitant, watching, as if witnessing a miracle. And then, impossibly, the crippled bomber leveled out, wings quivering but steady. It turned toward home. Even the German pilots, stunned, stopped firing. They could only stare as the half-winged American machine disappeared into the haze, a flying ghost refusing to die. That day, over the burning skies of North Africa, German engineers who had once mocked America's flying fortress began to understand what those two words truly meant. Long before the skies over Europe turned black with war, a quiet revolution was taking shape in the industrial heart of America. The year was 1934, and while most nations still viewed bombers as slow, fragile machines meant for limited strikes, engineers at Boeing were dreaming of something audacious, a flying battleship. They called it the Model 299, an aircraft so advanced that it seemed to belong to another era. With 4 powerful Wright Cyclone engines, a wingspan of over 100 feet, and a frame bristling with machine guns, it promised to deliver an entirely new philosophy of warfare, daylight precision bombing deep into enemy territory without the need for fighter escorts. When the prototype lifted off from Boeing Field that summer, observers were speechless. It climbed higher, flew faster, and carried more than any bomber before it. Reporters dubbed it the Flying Fortress after noticing its array of gun turrets glinting in the sun, a name that would become legend. Yet behind the glamour, tragedy struck early. The prototype crashed during testing, killing 2 crew members and nearly ending the program. Many in the U.S. Army Air Corps saw it as proof that Boeing's design was too complex, too costly. But others, especially young officers like Major Frank Andrews and General Hap Arnold, saw something more profound, the future of air power itself. As Europe drifted toward war, the lessons of Spain, Poland, and France showed the world how devastating air attacks could be. Germany's Luftwaffe had proven its might with the Stuka dive bombers and Heinkel He-111s raining destruction on cities and columns alike. But the Americans were charting a different path, one that valued engineering endurance over sheer aggression. Boeing's design philosophy centered on one word: redundancy. Every vital system had a backup, and every crew position was shielded by layers of aluminum and reinforced steel. The B-17 wasn't built to outrun death. It was built to survive it. By 1941, as the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the Flying Fortress was ready. Factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach began producing them in waves, each one representing not just a machine, but an industrial promise that American engineering could produce something both terrifying and indestructible. Crews who trained on the B-17 often spoke of it as more than an aircraft. It was a companion that could take punishment beyond belief and still bring them home. But across the Atlantic, in the laboratories and design offices of Germany, engineers laughed. To them, the B-17 was overbuilt, heavy, inefficient, and absurdly dependent on crew teamwork. They believed no plane that large could survive concentrated flak or the fury of the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. German philosophy favored efficiency, agility, and precision, qualities the fortress seemed to ignore in favor of brute strength. In the Luftwaffe's eyes, the Flying Fortress was a lumbering target dressed up as a miracle. What they did not yet understand was that Boeing's creation wasn't just a bomber. It was a flying system of survival, a mechanical organism designed to endure when all logic said it couldn't. By late 1942, the Allied strategy in Europe was beginning to take shape. The British Royal Air Force, scarred by devastating daylight losses early in the war, had shifted entirely to night bombing. They struck under cover of darkness, blanketing German cities in fire, but sacrificing accuracy for safety. The Americans, however, saw things differently. The U.S. Army Air Forces, newly arrived in England under the command of General Ira Eaker and the 8th Air Force, believed daylight precision bombing could break Germany's industrial backbone, if only their bombers could survive long enough to prove it. The theory was daring, even arrogant. Massive formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses, flying in tight box formations, would protect each other with interlocking fields of fire. Their Norden bomb sites, secret instruments of astonishing accuracy, promised to hit factories, oil refineries, and rail yards with surgical precision. American planners envisioned waves of daylight raids that would cripple the Nazi war machine without needing to flatten entire cities. But to the German high command and its engineers, this doctrine was naive. No formation, no matter how dense, could stand against flak bursts from hundreds of 88mm guns and the relentless attacks of Jagdgeschwader squadrons. As the first American bombers crossed the Channel in August 1942, German radar operators sounded the alarm. From bases at Lille, Bremen, and Hamburg, the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept what they mockingly called Fliegenfestungen, flying fortresses. The German pilots expected an easy hunt. They had faced the British Wellington and the Blenheim, fragile aircraft that folded under machine gun fire. But what they encountered was something else entirely. The B-17s came in waves, their defensive guns blazing from every direction, 10 men operating .50 caliber Brownings from nose to tail. Shells ripped through their aluminum skins, but the bombers kept flying. Some came back with holes big enough to crawl through. On the ground, German engineers studied the wrecks of downed B-17s and shook their heads in disbelief. Each system inside was duplicated or triplicate. Hydraulic, electrical, and fuel lines routed through separate channels. Armor plates wrapped around critical sections. Self-sealing fuel tanks that didn't explode even when punctured. It was a level of mechanical foresight they hadn't expected from what they once considered an industrially wasteful nation. One Luftwaffe report filed after a raid over Wilhelmshaven concluded with understated frustration. The American machine is not designed for beauty, but for endurance. It absorbs punishment far beyond what should be possible. Still, the losses were heavy. For every fortress that limped home, others fell burning into the sea or fields of northern France. The young crews of the 8th Air Force called their missions milk runs with grim irony, knowing that odds of survival dropped sharply after 25 sorties. Yet, despite staggering casualty rates, morale remained high, not because the men trusted luck, but because they trusted the machine that carried them. Veterans of the early raids recalled slapping the fuselage before takeoff as if reassuring a living comrade. They believed the fortress would bring them back. And so, through fire and attrition, the legend of the B-17 began to spread, from briefing rooms in England to interrogation cells in Germany. The bomber that engineers once laughed at was slowly earning a reputation not as a marvel of power, but as a miracle of persistence. And it would soon face the ultimate test, a mission so catastrophic that even its designers doubted any aircraft could survive. The secret behind the B-17's endurance wasn't brute force, it was foresight. Boeing's engineers had designed the aircraft with one obsession: survivability through redundancy. Every system that mattered had a twin, or even a triplet. If one hydraulic line was cut, another carried pressure from a separate path. If one engine failed, the remaining three could still generate enough lift to keep the massive bomber aloft. Even the control cables were split and shielded, snaking through alternate routes within the fuselage so that a single hit could not disable the rudder or elevators entirely. To the untrained eye, this looked like wasteful complexity. But to those who understood the brutal mathematics of air combat, it was the difference between returning home and vanishing over enemy lines. Inside the B-17, 10 men functioned like a single nervous system. Each gunner, navigator, and radio operator had overlapping duties in case one fell. Pilots often said the fortress felt alive, responding to the air will even under catastrophic damage. Crews grew attached to their machines, giving them nicknames and painting noses with names of lovers or hometowns, small human attempts to personalize an instrument of war. And again, the planes proved worthy of that affection. Reports circulated through air bases of bombers limping home with huge sections torn away, stories so incredible they were first dismissed as rumor until photographs confirmed them. German engineers, meanwhile, dissected captured airframes with a mixture of fascination and disdain. They admired the metallurgy, the robustness of its spars and ribs, but mocked its bulk and slow climb. Too heavy to maneuver, one Heinkel designer wrote, and therefore doomed against fighters. But the battlefield kept proving him wrong. Time and again, Luftwaffe pilots returned to base describing targets that refused to fall. Even when riddled with cannon fire, the fortresses seemed to stagger, recover, and crawl back toward the channel. The moral contrast between the two nations' designs could not have been sharper. Germany had built aircraft for dominance, agile, elegant, deadly. America had built one for endurance, stubborn, methodical, enduring. The B-17 was the embodiment of a philosophy that valued persistence over perfection, faith in structure over faith in speed. It was, in every sense, an engineer's answer to chaos. And beyond the metal and rivets lay something deeper, the trust between man and machine. Crews spoke of the fortress as if it had a spirit, a protective soul forged in steel. That relationship between human frailty and mechanical resilience would soon define the moral backbone of the American air war over Europe. In the skies above occupied Europe, the B-17's durability collided head-on with Germany's air warfare philosophy. The Luftwaffe's leadership, shaped by rapid victories in the early years of the war, believed in speed, precision, and dominance of the air through superior tactics. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were designed for short, decisive bursts of combat, elegant predators meant to strike fast and disappear. The Americans, in contrast, had placed their faith in endurance. Their bombers were slower, heavier, and less maneuverable, but built for a war of attrition, to absorb punishment and still deliver a payload to its target. It was a duel not just of technology, but of philosophy. Every mission revealed the difference between the two schools of thought. German fighters launched in organized swarm formations, diving from the sun in precision attacks, often slicing off wings or tails with cannon bursts. Yet time after time, they watched bombers that should have fallen remain in formation. Gunners inside those B-17s turned the sky into a wall of lead, tracers streaking in every direction. A Luftwaffe ace once admitted in frustration that attacking a fortress formation was like charging into a flying fortress of steel and fire. The interlocking gun coverage, though imperfect, created such dense defensive fire that only the bravest, or most desperate, pilots dared to get close. Meanwhile, engineers on both sides studied wreckage and results. The Germans were baffled by the resilience of American aircraft systems. When a Heinkel or Dornier took a hit in its fuel line or cooling system, it almost always perished in flames. The B-17, however, could lose 2 engines, lose half its control surfaces, and still limp home on sheer mechanical will. To many in the Luftwaffe's technical corps, this seemed absurdly wasteful, too many redundancies, too much weight. But in the field, numbers told another story. Fortresses that looked like wrecks often returned, patched, and flew again within days. Their losses were terrible, but their returns were legendary. Leadership on both sides wrestled with these realities. For General Eaker and his staff, every returning B-17 reinforced the American belief in daylight bombing's future. For Hermann Göring and his air staff, the persistence of these bombers was an embarrassment. Göring famously demanded explanations after reports described heavily damaged fortresses crossing back over the channel. They should not be able to fly, he barked in anger, yet they did again and again. German propaganda mocked the Americans as wasteful dreamers, but privately, Luftwaffe commanders understood they were facing an enemy whose industrial power and engineering stubbornness defied logic. As the war dragged into 1943, both sides grew exhausted. Aircrew spoke of thousand-mile days, missions that felt endless, where death came from above and below in waves of flak and fire. For the Americans, the B-17 became more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of endurance in a war defined by destruction. For the Germans, it became an object of reluctant respect, a machine they once laughed at, now feared and studied. But all the theories, doctrines, and philosophies would soon be tested in one defining moment, a mission so catastrophic that would turn the Flying Fortress from a respected machine into a myth of survival. It was February 1st, 1943, a day that would etch itself into aviation legend. The 414th Bomb Squadron of the 97th Bomb Group lifted off from Biskra, Algeria, their mission simple on paper: bomb the German supply depots in Bizerta, Tunisia. The North African sun glared down on the endless desert, and as the formation climbed to altitude, the crews tightened their oxygen masks and checked their guns. Among them was one aircraft that would soon become the stuff of legend, the B-17F All-American. She was an ordinary fortress by appearance, olive drab and patched from earlier missions, carrying a crew of 10 men who trusted her with their lives. As they neared the target, the formation met the first wave of flak. Black clouds burst around them like volcanic smoke, fragments slicing through aluminum skins and shattering plexiglass noses. The air filled with metallic thunder. Radio chatter crackled, fragments of prayer, command, and panic. The All-American stayed tight in formation, releasing its bombs cleanly over the enemy port below. Explosions rippled across the ground, but before the crew could even admire the accuracy, German fighters dove out of the sun. Dozens of Messerschmitts swarmed the bombers, their cannon fire tearing through the formation like knives. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, the pilot, kept his hands steady on the yoke while his co-pilot called out damage reports. The tail gunner screamed that another fortress had exploded, then silence. Moments later, a German Bf-109 streaked toward them from below. Sergeant Kendrick, the tail gunner, opened fire, his twin Brownings glowing red. The Messerschmitt's rounds slammed into the B-17's tail section, ripping through metal and sending a tremor through the entire fuselage. Then came the unthinkable. Another German fighter, fatally damaged by gunfire, collided midair with the All-American. The impact shredded the tail assembly, slicing through the rear fuselage like a saw. For a moment, the bomber seemed to split in two. Inside, chaos reigned. The men were thrown against bulkheads as the aircraft pitched violently. Oxygen masks ripped away, ammunition boxes tumbled through the way section, and freezing air screamed through the gaping hole where the tail used to be. The intercom went dead. Bragg's instruments spun wildly, but somehow the plane didn't fall. The massive wings still caught the air. The remaining engines held. The fortress refused to die. Bragg pulled back on the control column, fighting both gravity and disbelief. Without the tail, the aircraft should have entered an unrecoverable spin, but the fortress held steady, as if sheer willpower held its shattered frame together. Waist gunners crawled through the wreckage to check on their crewmates, clinging to what remained of the catwalk, afraid one wrong step would send them plunging through open sky. Against every law of aerodynamics, the B-17 leveled out. The radio operator managed to reconnect a damaged wire long enough to signal their intent to return to base. When they turned for home, the All-American became a sight no one could forget. Her tail section hung by a few thin strips of metal, Control cables trail behind her like streamers. Luftwaffe pilots circled but did not fire. Some simply watched in astonishment as the crippled bomber kept flying. One German ace later wrote, "We could not believe what we saw. That machine was finished, and yet it lived." For nearly 2 hours, the All-American limped back across the Mediterranean, losing altitude but never control. The crew's faith in their plane became literal. They talked to her, pleaded with her, encouraged her to hold together just a little longer. When they finally reached the base at Biskra, the landing gear miraculously lowered. Bragg brought her down in a rough but steady descent. The tail finally collapsed upon touchdown, but the rest of the aircraft remained intact. Every man aboard survived. The photographs taken that day stunned the world. The rear fuselage was nearly gone, daylight visible straight through the bomber. Newspapers across America printed the images under headlines like "The Flying Fortress That Wouldn't Die." Engineers who examined the wreckage confirmed what pilots already knew. Boeing's design had gone beyond expectation. It had crossed into legend. The All-American survival was not just a story of mechanical triumph. It was proof of concept, the validation of America's faith in engineering foresight, redundancy, and courage under fire. And it was only the beginning. Across the skies of Europe, more legends like it were waiting to be written, each one turning German disbelief into reluctant awe. Not long after the All-American's miraculous return, another story emerged from the frozen skies over northern Germany, one that would shake both sides of the war and redefine what honor in combat truly meant. It began on December 20th, 1943, when a B-17F named Ye Olde Pub lifted off from Kimbolton Airfield in England as part of the 379th Bomb Group. Its mission, strike the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, deep inside enemy territory. The air was brutally cold, 40 degrees below zero at altitude, and the bomber formations gleamed silver against the pale winter light. As the formation neared the target, the German defenses awoke with fury. Flak guns blanketed the sky, detonations flashing like black lightning. The Ye Olde Pub, piloted by 21-year-old Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown of West Virginia, took a direct hit to its nose. The blast knocked out one engine and crippled another. Shrapnel ripped through the cockpit, wounding Brown and several crew members. Hydraulic systems failed, oxygen lines ruptured, and half the instrumentation went dead. Yet Brown pressed on to the target, releasing his bombs before trying to turn for home, alone, trailing smoke, bleeding altitude, and marked for death. Moments later, a swarm of Luftwaffe fighters descended, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, slicing through the thin air with cannon bursts. The Ye Olde Pub was hit repeatedly. Bullets tore open the fuselage, severed control cables, and destroyed the tail gun. Every gunner except one was wounded or dead. The bomber's nose was shattered, its tail shredded. Blood froze in the air as the unpressurized cabin filled with snow and smoke. Charlie Brown, half conscious, managed to level the aircraft just above stall speed. Somehow, impossibly, the Fortress kept flying. Watching from above, German ace Franz Stigler closed in for the kill. A veteran with dozens of victories, he expected to finish off another crippled bomber, an easy victory in a deadly game. But as he approached, he saw through the jagged holes in the fuselage. The dead and wounded crew, a terrified tail gunner slumped over his guns, and a pilot desperately trying to keep his men alive. Stigler hesitated. His finger rested on the trigger, then slowly released. Instead of attacking, he eased his throttle back and flew alongside the shattered B-17, astonished that it was still airborne. For several minutes, the two aircraft, enemies locked in a silent, fragile truce, flew side by side. Stigler gestured for Brown to land and surrender, but Brown shook his head, determined to make it home. Understanding the young American's resolve, Stigler did something no one expected. He saluted the bomber and escorted it out of German airspace, ensuring no other fighters would attack. Then he peeled away, disappearing into the clouds. The Ye Olde Pub crossed the North Sea with one engine still burning, holes in its wings large enough to crawl through, and its fuselage shredded nearly in half. Against all odds, it reached England and crash-landed its seething airfield. Every surviving crewman staggered out in disbelief, frostbitten but alive. Their aircraft looked impossible, a flying corpse that had refused to fall. When photographs were circulated among U.S. engineers and Allied intelligence, the reaction was universal. How could something so destroyed still return to base? Word of the encounter spread quietly through both air forces. The Germans were stunned not just by the B-17's endurance, but by the moral weight of the moment. One of their own had spared an enemy out of respect for a machine and the courage of those inside it. Decades later, in 1990, Charles Brown and Franz Stigler would meet again, not as enemies, but as brothers. Stigler told him softly, "I could not have shot at that aircraft. It was a masterpiece of humanity." That sentiment echoed across generations. For all the blood and fire that filled the skies of World War II, stories like All-American and Ye Olde Pub reminded the world that beyond metal and war, there was something greater at work, an enduring respect between men, and the unbreakable spirit of the machines that carried them through hell. In the aftermath of those incredible missions, disbelief spread through the Luftwaffe like wildfire. German ground crews who examined the wreckage of crashed or captured B-17s began to speak of them with a kind of grim admiration. What they found defied everything they'd been taught about aircraft design. Frames that should have buckled still held their shape. Fuel tanks that should have ignited were intact. Control systems that looked severed still managed to move. Reports flooded up the chain of command, describing the Flying Fortress as an enemy machine of almost unnatural resilience. At first, the German leadership refused to take the story seriously. To Göring and his staff, they were exaggerated tales meant to boost American morale. But as reconnaissance photographs and captured gun camera footage accumulated, the truth became undeniable. Luftwaffe pilots were recording kills, only to see the same bombers appear again days later. Mechanics on the ground began marking some of the returning aircraft they had damaged, shocked to learn those very machines had bombed their targets again within a week. This new reality forced the Luftwaffe to adapt. Commanders realized that simply damaging a B-17 was no longer enough. It had to be completely destroyed. Attacks grew more aggressive, closing to suicidal ranges where a few well-placed cannon bursts could rip through a bomber's cockpit or engines. Pilots were ordered to target fuel tanks and bomb bays specifically, where a single detonation could guarantee a kill. But even these tactics carried heavy costs. The defensive firepower of a fortress formation was overwhelming. Entire squadrons of experienced German pilots were lost trying to break through those rings of .50 caliber fire. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, stories of survival spread like scripture. Every photograph of a B-17 riddled with holes, yet home on its wheels, became a poster of faith. Newspapers in the United States turned the aircraft into an icon of courage, the plane that brought them back. For the young crews training in America, those images meant something personal. They saw in the B-17 not just a weapon, but a promise that if they did their duty, their fortress would not abandon them. Back in Germany, engineers scrambled to understand what made the American bombers so difficult to kill. They conducted metallurgical tests, examined armor thickness, and even tried to mimic the concept of compartmentalized systems in their later designs. But it was too late. By mid-1943, the tide of the air war was beginning to turn. While German factories repaired and replaced fighters at an ever slower pace, the American production lines were surging ahead, building B-17s faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The Flying Fortress had proven its worth not only in combat, but in concept. It was no longer just a bomber. It was a psychological weapon. Its presence over the Reich's industrial heartland told both sides the same truth. America's machines could take the punishment, and its spirit would not break. By 1944, the B-17 had transcended its role as a mere weapon. It had become a living emblem of industrial willpower, a symbol of a nation's determination forged in aluminum and fire. In the hangars of the 8th Air Force, ground crews treated each returning aircraft with reverence. They would run their hands across torn fuselages and twisted spars, often in silence, as if thanking the plane for bringing their friends home alive. Mechanics worked through the night patching bullet holes, replacing engines, and straightening bent propellers. Some aircraft returned so frequently in damaged condition that crews began calling them lucky souls, as though the machines themselves had personalities. Photographs from those days captured scenes that still defy belief. Fortresses landing with one wingtip nearly gone, others limping in with their noses shattered, tail sections dangling by a thread. Each return was more than a technical achievement. It was an act of faith rewarded. Even men who had once doubted the logic of daylight raids found themselves inspired by the sheer resilience of the aircraft and those who flew them. For the Allies, the Flying Fortress came to embody the stubborn endurance of democracy itself, a machine that might be battered, bent, and torn apart, but would not collapse. The Germans could not ignore this transformation. Reports circulated within the Luftwaffe of pilots who saluted crippled fortresses as they passed overhead, unwilling to waste ammunition on what seemed invincible. Engineers at Messerschmitt and Junkers privately admitted that the B-17 had set a new standard for combat durability, one no European aircraft could match at that scale. Even within the corridors of the Reich Air Ministry, a grudging respect took hold. They have built a machine that refuses to die, one internal memo reportedly noted. As production lines in the United States reached full capacity, nearly 12,700 B-17s rolled out of Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed plants, more than the total number of all German bombers produced during the same period. Each was a masterpiece of mass production and precision craftsmanship. Every rivet, every bolt, was an expression of a national effort that united engineers, factory workers, and pilots in a single cause. When squadrons of hundreds of B-17s filled the sky in tight formation, their silver skins glinting like a moving city of light, even hardened soldiers below stopped to watch in awe. The noise was deafening, a thunderous declaration of Allied inevitability. For Germany, it marked a grim turning point. The once proud Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. Its radar screens lit up daily with endless formations approaching from the west. No matter how many were shot down, the bombers kept coming. The laughter that once greeted America's Flying Fortress had long since faded into silence, replaced by weary respect and quiet dread. By the war's final year, the B-17 had become more than a machine of war. It was a myth in motion, a legend forged through sacrifice, courage, and design brilliance. Its battered survivors stood as monuments to endurance, proof that human ingenuity, when guided by purpose, could build something greater than fear itself. And as peace finally descended on a shattered world, the image of those wounded fortresses limping home through smoke and cloud became one of the enduring symbols of the entire conflict, not of destruction, but of survival. In the quiet years that followed the war, when the roar of engines faded and the skies above Europe grew still, the legend of the B-17 Flying Fortress endured. It became more than a story about a machine. It became a story about what human beings can build when they believe in endurance over ease, resilience over speed. The engineers who designed it in Seattle never intended to create a symbol. They intended to create a tool of precision and survival. Yet, through fire and ruin, their creation came to embody the spirit of an entire generation, one that refused to surrender even when the odds were impossible. The men who flew those fortresses remembered them not as cold instruments of war, but as living companions. Decades later, when veterans gathered at reunions, they spoke about their aircraft the way others might speak about an old friend, one who had carried them through the darkest moments of their lives. Many could still recall the smell of oil and gunpowder, the sound of wind whistling through torn metal, and the sensation of wheels touching the runway after a mission they were never supposed to survive. The machine had protected them, and in a way, they had protected its legacy. Historians now see the B-17 not just as a triumph of engineering, but as a moral lesson in persistence. It proved that strength is not always about perfection, but about endurance, about building something that can absorb failure and still keep moving forward. The Germans, who once mocked it as inefficient, came to respect it as a masterpiece of rugged practicality. And the world learned something quietly profound from its story, that courage and craftsmanship, bound together, can make even metal seem alive. When surviving B-17s fly today at air shows, their engines still thunder with that deep, unmistakable rhythm, the same pulse that once echoed across the skies of Europe. People look up and see more than an aircraft. They see the heartbeat of history. The Flying Fortress earned its name not through arrogance, but through proof written in smoke, steel, and sacrifice. And as it glides overhead, graceful and defiant even after all these years, one can't help but remember those words whispered by men who saw it in battle. It wasn't supposed to fly, but it did.